The child's fever had been climbing for 6 hours, and Commander Thyrocos was running out of specialists to summon. He stood at the observation window of the Royal Infirmary's isolation ward, watching through triple-layered crystal glass as his daughter convulsed on a med platform that cost more than most frigates. Her pale silver skin had gone translucent at the extremities, fingers, toes, the delicate tips of her pointed ears, the way Vithrani children's skin turned when their thermal regulation collapsed. She was 4 years old. She weighed almost nothing. And the 9 foremost physicians of the Vithrani Ascendancy were standing in a half-circle around her bed, arguing about which of their failed treatments to attempt again. Kaz pressed his forehead against the glass. It was cool. Everything in the infirmary was cool, calibrated to Vithrani standard, 12 degrees below what humans found comfortable, and right now his daughter needed warmth that the machines could not manufacture. "Commander," the voice belonged to senior physician Orthan, who had stepped through the ward's pressure seal and now stood behind Kaz with the practiced stillness of a man delivering news he did not want to deliver. His ice-blue skin was drawn tight across angular cheekbones, and his luminous violet eyes would not quite settle on Kaz's face. "The tremor pattern has not responded to neural stabilization. We have administered 3 variations of the standard protocol. The child's hypothalamic regulator is, we believe it is an autoimmune cascade. Her body is attacking its own thermal center." "Then stop the cascade." "We have attempted immunosuppressive intervention. Twice. The cascade is too deeply embedded in the regulatory pathway. If we suppress further, we risk collapsing her autonomic function entirely." Kaz turned from the window. He was tall even for a Vithrani 7 feet, with the lean, angular build of a career military officer who had never permitted himself the luxury of softness. His silver-white hair was cropped close to his skull in the command style, and the faint bioluminescent markings along his jawline, the stress indicators every Vithrani possessed, were glowing a steady, furious amber. His officers would have recognized that color. It meant he was past anger and deep into the cold terrain beyond it. "What are you telling me, Orthan?" The physician's ears flattened against his skull. "I am telling you that we do not understand the mechanism. The cascade is unlike anything in our pediatric literature. We have consulted the Imperial Medical Archive remotely. We have cross-referenced symptom clusters across the full Vithrani medical database. There are no precedents." "No precedents." "None, Commander." Kaz looked back through the glass. His daughter's name was Iliene. She had been laughing yesterday morning, chasing a light moth through the palace garden with her small bare feet slapping the stone path, her silver hair streaming behind her like a comet's tail. He had been late for a fleet briefing. He had stopped at the garden gate to watch her for 11 seconds. He had counted them, and then turned away because duty was duty and the briefing would not wait. 11 seconds. He would trade his entire commission for 11 more. "Get me someone who can fix this," he said. His voice was the voice his subordinates feared, the one that preceded consequences. "I do not care about precedent, and I do not care about your literature. Get me someone who has seen something like this before." Orthan hesitated, one long-fingered hand rising to the collar of his medical coat. "Commander, I have already contacted the Vithrani Pediatric Institute on Kale Prime. Specialist Vayantha, the foremost authority on juvenile thermal dysregulation, reviewed the child's biotelemetry remotely and recommended the neural stabilization protocol that has already failed. I have also consulted the specialist corps on Thesson, whose senior immunologist, Physician Drayle, suggested a phased immunosuppression approach. Which also failed. Which also failed, yes. And I have a standing request with the Royal College of Physicians on Ithara. They are convening a consultation panel, but their earliest projected response is..." "How long?" Orthan's ears pulled flatter. 18 hours, possibly longer. The panel chair is on sabbatical and his deputy is requesting a formal case brief before convening. Ka stared at him. The amber glow along his jaw intensified by a shade. Behind the glass, the monitor tracking Ilien's thermal regulation spiked erratically, a jagged red mountain range that bore no resemblance to the smooth, rolling pattern of a healthy Vithrani child. 18 hours, Koss repeated. My daughter does not have 18 hours. No, Commander. Based on current cascade velocity, we estimate critical autonomic failure in approximately 7 to 9 hours. At that point, intervention becomes significantly more difficult. The number landed in the room like ordnance. Koss felt it strike the base of his sternum and spread outward. 7 hours. In 7 hours, his daughter would cross a threshold from which even a miracle would struggle to retrieve her, and the finest medical establishment in the Ascendancy was waiting for a committee chair to return from sabbatical. He turned back to the observation window. A junior physician, Tessith, a young woman with pale lavender skin and silver-streaked hair who served as Orathan's deputy, was running a handheld scanner over Ilien's chest, her expression taut with the particular concentration of someone who knows their readings will not improve but cannot stop checking. Behind her, two senior physicians were having a quiet, intense argument over a holographic display that projected the child's immune cascade in 3 dimensions. A branching, recursive pattern of red and amber that looked, to Koss's tactical eye, like a battle map of a war being fought inside a body too small to contain it. A third physician, Specialist Corel, who had arrived from the surgical wing an hour ago with the confident stride of a man accustomed to solving what others could not, was reviewing the immunosuppression data on a separate console. He had proposed a targeted microdose approach that would suppress individual immune pathways in sequence rather than the whole system at once. The theory was elegant. The simulation had been promising. The application, administered 20 minutes ago, had produced no measurable change in the cascade's velocity. Corel was now staring at his console with the expression of a man whose theory had just been disproven by a 4-year-old's biology. While Corel recalculated, a fourth approach was attempted. Physician Ailura, a specialist in pediatric neural mapping who had arrived from the research division, with a mobile cranial imager the size of a small table. She had theorized that the cascade's targeting mechanism might be disrupted by a precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulse delivered to the hypothalamic region. The theory required mapping Ilien's neural architecture to sub-millimeter resolution, which required the child to remain still for 90 seconds. Ilien could not remain still. She trembled continuously, and the tremors had grown stronger over the past hour, deep, convulsive shudders that originated in her core and radiated outward through her limbs. The cranial imager could not lock its targeting grid. Ailura attempted the procedure 3 times, adjusting compensators between each attempt. The third attempt produced a partial lock that held for 41 seconds before a seizure broke it. Ailura withdrew, her pale silver-white skin flushed with the lavender stress coloring that Vithrani showed under sustained frustration, and told Orathan that she could not proceed without sedation. They could not sedate the child. Sedation in the context of an active autoimmune cascade carried a 12% risk of cardiac suppression in pediatric Vithrani patients. Orathan judged the risk unacceptable. Ailura did not disagree. She packed her imager in silence and left the ward without making eye contact with anyone. That was 4 failed approaches. 4 specialists, each one the best in their discipline, each one walking out of the room with nothing to offer except an explanation of why their intervention could not proceed. Koss watched them leave. He watched each departure the way a commander watches defensive positions being abandoned, noting the failure, measuring the shrinking perimeter, calculating how much ground remained. The monitors behind the glass flared. Ilien's thermal readout crossed into a range that one of the physicians had quietly designated as Zone 3, a term Koss was not supposed to have heard, but his hearing had been tuned by 30 years of catching the words his subordinates said when they thought he was not listening. Zone 3 meant the cascade was accelerating. Zone 3 meant the clock had gotten shorter. "You have contacted Vithrani physicians," Koss said. Orathan's gaze sharpened. "Yes, Commander, the finest in the Ascendancy. There are non-Vithrani medical practitioners on this world." A pause. The kind of pause that contains an entire architecture of assumption, species hierarchy, professional credentialing, institutional pride, and the quiet certainty that the answer to a Vithrani problem must originate from a Vithrani mind. "There are, Commander. They serve in auxiliary roles, field hospitals, refugee processing centers, frontier clinics. Their credentials are not recognized by the Imperial Medical Board. They operate under provisional licensure at best. They are not qualified to." "I did not ask for qualifications. I asked for someone who has seen this before." "Commander, I cannot in professional conscience recommend the involvement of an unaccredited." "Orathan." Koss stepped toward him, and the physician who had served the Ascendancy for 40 years and briefed emperors on plague trajectories took a half step back. It was an involuntary retreat, the body responding to command presence before the mind could organize a defense. "My daughter is dying. Your professional conscience has had 6 hours to produce results, and it has produced none. Find me someone, anyone, who has treated a condition like this in a living patient. I do not care what species they are. I do not care what classification they hold. I do not care if they practice medicine in a ditch with a sharpened stick. Find them and bring them here." Orathan swallowed. His luminous eyes flickered to the observation window, to the child, to the monitor's jagged red peaks. Then he inclined his head, the deep, stiff bow of a man whose professional objections had just been overruled by something he could not argue with. "I will search the non-Vithrani medical registries." "Do it now." Orathan turned and walked to the nearest console with the measured gait of a man whose professional universe had just been rearranged. Koss went back to the glass. He pressed both hands flat against it, as if he could transmit something through the triple layers: warmth, will, the simple animal demand of a parent whose child is slipping. He watched the monitors. He counted the seconds between thermal spikes. He listened to Tessith's voice murmuring readings into the ward's recording system. Cascade acceleration, 0.4% per hour. Thymic output declining at 2.7 units. Peripheral translucence progressing to secondary dermis. And he felt each data point like a nail being driven into something he could not protect. Ilien shuddered on the med platform. A fine tremor ran through her entire body, more violent than the last, strong enough to dislodge one of the monitoring leads from her wrist. It dangled free, trailing its cable across the sheet, until Tessith gently reattached it with hands that were not entirely steady. The child's fingers were nearly transparent now. Koss could see the faint silver tracery of veins beneath the skin, a delicate map of a body trying to hold itself together against its own immune system's assault. He was a commander. He had built his entire career on the principle that problems were solvable if you applied the right resources with sufficient force and precision. He had maneuvered fleets through gravitational anomalies, organized planetary evacuations under direct fire, held defensive perimeters against forces that outnumbered him 4-1 with nothing but positioning and discipline, and the refusal to yield. He had never, in 30 years of service, stood in front of a problem he could not command his way through. He was standing in front of one now. And the problem weighed 30 pounds and had silver hair, and had called him Papa this morning. The registry search took Orathan 14 minutes. When he returned, his expression had the brittle, compressed quality of a man carrying information he considered beneath the dignity of the conversation. There is one non-Vithrani practitioner on world who has logged cases with comparable presentation, he said. A human female. Name: Nessa Drummond. Age 34. Terran Federation former field medic honorably discharged with commendation 5 years prior. Current assignment: Auxiliary Medical Support, Vithrani Frontier Refugee Processing Center, Station KL 7. Where is that? 14 kilometers south. A converted cargo facility near the southern resettlement corridor. A cargo facility? Yes, Commander. She treats displaced refugee families, primarily non-Vithrani populations, Drelathi, Kalosi mixed species, though the center also processes Vithrani civilians displaced from the border provinces. Orthan's tone carried the particular flatness of a professional reciting facts he wished were different. Her registry file notes 11 cases of what she terms thermal rejection syndrome across 4 species, including one partial Vithrani infant approximately 8 months ago. The words hit Koss like a second impact, but this one was slower, deeper, and aimed at something structural rather than visceral. 8 months, he said. She treated a Vithrani child for this condition 8 months ago. A partial Vithrani infant, yes, half Vithrani, half Kalosi, in the refugee center. And her findings were not entered into the Imperial Medical Archive. Orthan's jaw tightened. A muscle moved beneath his ice-blue skin, visible along the sharp line of his cheekbone. Her reports are filed through the Auxiliary Non-Critical Medical Channel. That channel is reviewed by a junior administrative clerk once per fiscal quarter. The report was filed. It was not escalated. It was not read. I cannot confirm with certainty what was or was not. It was not read, Orthan. My daughter has been seizing for 6 hours because a report filed 8 months ago by a field medic in a cargo bay was not read by anyone in your system. The sentence fell into the room and shattered something invisible, a pane of glass that had always been there, so clean and so familiar that nobody had noticed it, the pane between what the Ascendancy saw and what it refused to see. Orthan did not respond. There was no response that could survive the weight of what the commander had just laid on the floor between them. Bring her here, Koss said. Now. 31 minutes later, a human woman walked into the Royal Infirmary carrying a battered canvas field bag over one shoulder, and everything Commander Thyrol Koss understood about competence began, quietly and irreversibly, to collapse. She did not look like someone who belonged in a royal infirmary. She looked like someone who had been pulled out of a trench and told to walk 14 kilometers in a hurry. Her dark hair was tied back in a knot that had come half loose during whatever she had been doing when the summons arrived. Her olive skin was wind-roughened and mapped with the particular where that comes from years of field work under inadequate shelter, fine lines around the eyes, a deepened crease between the brows, the slight unevenness of a complexion that had been sun-damaged and chemical-damaged, and never given time to recover between exposures. She wore a faded gray utility jacket over scrubs that had been laundered so many times the fabric had gone soft and translucent at the elbows, and her boots, heavy-soled, scuffed. The left lace knotted where it had broken, left faint dusty prints on the infirmary's pristine white floor. The 9 Vithrani physicians watched her cross the ward the way a body watches a foreign particle enter its bloodstream, tracking, assessing, preparing to reject. Koss watched from the observation window. Frustration had carved itself so deeply into him over the past 7 hours that it had become a kind of geology, layered, compacted, immovable. Every specialist who had walked through that door had entered carrying credentials and departed carrying excuses. This human, this field medic from a refugee processing center, was the last name on a list he had demanded be exhaustive. If she failed, the list was empty, and his daughter would die before the sabbatical committee returned his call. Nessa Drummond stopped at the foot of the med platform and looked at the child. She did not touch anything. She did not speak. She stood there for perhaps 8 seconds, her head tilted slightly to one side, her eyes moving over Ilien's small form with an attention that was neither clinical nor distant. Koss, who had spent his career reading people under pressure, saw something cross her face that none of the Vithrani physicians had shown in 7 hours of consultation. She was not studying the child as a case file. She was seeing her as a child. Then she set her field bag on the floor, crouched beside it, and began removing instruments that bore no resemblance to anything in the infirmary's gleaming arsenal. A stethoscope, actual analog tubing, and a tarnished metal diaphragm, the kind of diagnostic tool a Vithrani physician would have called a museum exhibit. A battered thermometer with a cracked plastic housing that she handled with the care of blown glass, a small jar of amber paste, a cloth not sterile synthetic, but soft woven fabric, faded from years of washing, the kind humans used for their own infants. Senior physician Orathan stepped forward. His tall frame threw a shadow across the field bag's contents. This child is in critical autoimmune cascade. The treatment protocol requires immunodynamic intervention at the cellular level, whatever you intend to. I can see the cascade, Nessa said. Her voice was quiet, unhurried, the voice of someone who had said similar things in far worse rooms and had learned that volume never helped. I've seen it before. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It had mass and temperature, and it pressed against the walls of the ward like a change in atmospheric pressure. 9 Vithrani physicians, each carrying decades of specialized training, stood motionless. Orathan's pointed ears went rigid. That is not possible. This cascade has no precedent in Vithrani medical. In your literature. Nessa glanced up at him, and the glance was steady, unconfrontational, and immovable, the look of someone who had no interest in winning an argument and every intention of treating a patient. It has precedent in mine. We call it thermal rejection syndrome. Human children get a version of it, different cellular mechanism, same terminal presentation. The body's thermal regulator misidentifies its own tissue as foreign material and launches a full immune attack against it. Autoimmune cascade that presents as fever but is not a fever. The temperature spike is the symptom of the immune system trying to burn out what it perceives as an invader, but the invader is the child's own regulatory cells. Your immunosuppressants won't work because you're suppressing the entire immune response uniformly. You need to suppress only the misidentification pathway. The targeting error. Leave the rest of the immune architecture intact. Orathan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Behind him, Tessith had lowered her scanner and was staring at the human medic with an expression Koss recognized from his own tactical officers. The look of someone rapidly and involuntarily reassessing a situation's entire threat matrix. The specificity required to isolate a single targeting pathway in a pediatric autoimmune cascade is the pharmacological precision alone would. You don't isolate it with drugs, Nessa said. She reached into her bag and produced a thin ceramic disc about the size of a large coin, attached to an adhesive patch. The disc was clearly handmade, its edges slightly uneven, its surface scored with minute calibration marks scratched by a steady hand with a crude tool. You isolate it with a decoy. This is a thermal signature emitter. I built it from refugee medical supplies, standard issue thermal coils, a ceramic substrate cut from a broken diagnostic panel, adhesive bandage backing. It broadcasts a low-level heat pattern that mimics the tissue signature the immune system is attacking. You adhere it over the thymic plexus. The immune cascade redirects to the emitter instead of the child's own cells. The emitter absorbs the attack harmlessly. Once the cascade breaks its feedback loop, the body resets itself. The immune system stands down. She held up the disc. It looked like something assembled on a workbench from salvaged parts, which is exactly what it was, a disc of kiln-hardened clay embedded with thermal coils stripped from a broken diagnostic panel, powered by a coin cell battery soldered to its back with a bead of repurposed bonding wire. Total value, approximately 6 credits, less than the cost of a single monitoring lead in this ward. How long does this take? Cass's voice came through the intercom before he realized he had pressed the button. Every head in the ward turned toward the observation window. Nessa looked up at him. She did not flinch at the sight of a Vithrani commander in full formal charcoal, his bioluminescent stress markers blazing amber, his expression the kind of controlled fury that preceded fleet-scale consequences. She looked at him the way she would look at any parent standing behind glass while their child shook, with directness, and with patience, and without theater. "About 40 minutes for the cascade to fully redirect," she said. "Another hour for the fever to break. Then she'll sleep deep, restorative sleep, 6 to 8 hours. She'll be hungry when she wakes up." "You are certain this will work?" "I've done this 11 times. 7 human children, 2 Drelathi, 1 Kalosi, 1 half Vithrani infant at the KL7 processing center 8 months ago. All 11 recovered fully. 0 complications. The mechanism is the same across species. The thermal regulatory system is evolutionarily conserved. What varies is the anatomical placement of the thymic plexus and the specific tissue signature the emitter needs to replicate. I calibrate each device for the species." "You calibrate a handmade ceramic disc for each species?" "Yes, Commander. This one is calibrated for full Vithrani physiology. I made it on the transport here, based on the half Vithrani case 8 months ago, adjusted for full species thermal coefficients." She said it the way a carpenter would say, "I cut the board to length." A fact of practice, not a performance of skill. "I brought 2, in case the first needed repositioning." Cass looked at his daughter through the glass. She was trembling on the med platform, her silver skin translucent, her small fingers curled against the sheet. 7 hours of the finest medical establishment in the Ascendancy. 11 remote specialists consulted across 3 worlds, 4 failed protocols, 1 sabbatical committee, and standing at his daughter's bedside was a woman who had built the answer from a broken diagnostic panel in the back of a military transport on the ride over. "Do it," he said. It was not permission. It was an order given by a man who had run out of everything else. Nessa turned to the child. She moved with the particular economy of a person who has worked in spaces where speed matters and panic kills. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no performance for the 9-physician audience watching her every movement. She peeled the adhesive backing from the thermal emitter with her thumb, placed her stethoscope against the child's chest. Orthan visibly winced at the contact of analog metal on Vithrani skin, and listened for 12 seconds, her eyes unfocused, her full attention in her fingertips and ears. She shifted the stethoscope lower, to a point below the sternum that was not part of any standard Vithrani cardiac assessment protocol. Coril, watching from 3 paces away, opened his mouth to object to the placement. Tessith put a hand on his arm. He closed his mouth. "Thymic plexus is here on Vithrani children," Nessa said, more to herself than to anyone. "Offset from the human position by about 3 centimeters inferior and 1 centimeter lateral, consistent with the half Vithrani case." She placed the ceramic disc on the child's silver skin, pressed the adhesive edges flat with both thumbs, held them for a 5 count and stepped back. Nothing happened. The monitors continued their jagged cascade. The child continued to tremble. The 9 physicians stood in their half-circle and watched the handmade disc sit on the skin of a commander's daughter like a pebble on a glacier. 1 minute, 2. Specialist Coril shifted his weight. He had positioned himself near the secondary monitoring console, his arms folded across his chest in the posture of a man prepared to document a failure he considered inevitable. His expression was carefully neutral, but his ears, the involuntary betrayers of Vithrani emotional state, were angled forward in what Koss recognized as the orientation of skepticism, awaiting confirmation. 3 minutes 4. Tessith glanced at Orathan. Orathan did not return the look. He was watching the ceramic disc with the intensity of a man who could not afford for it to work and could not afford for it to fail, because either outcome would reshape his professional landscape in ways he was not yet ready to calculate. 5 minutes. Koss gripped the window ledge. His knuckles had gone pale, the Vithrani equivalent of white-knuckled, his bioluminescent markings flickering between amber and something darker. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear the monitors. He could hear the near silence of 9 physicians holding their professional breath. Then so gradually that he almost missed it, the tremor frequency slowed. Not stopped, slowed. The peaks on the neural monitor stretched apart, the intervals between them widening like a held breath getting longer. The jagged red mountain range on the thermal display softened at its peaks, not flattening, but rounding, the razor edges dulling into something that resembled worn hills instead of fresh fractures. Nessa watched the monitors with the patience of someone who had learned that healing does not announce itself with fanfare. She stood beside the med platform with her hands loose at her sides, her field bag at her feet, and she waited the way only someone who has waited beside 11 other beds can wait, without fidgeting, without rechecking instruments, without the need to intervene further. The intervention was placed. Now it was the body's turn. At 8 minutes, the child's skin color began to return. The translucence at the fingertips faded, replaced by the soft silver glow that Koss remembered from every morning he had lifted Ilienne from her bed and carried her to breakfast, her small warm weight against his shoulder, her breath on his neck, her voice saying Papa in the particular way she said it, half awake and trusting. He put his hand flat on the glass. At 14 minutes the tremors stopped, fully stopped. The neural monitor settled to a smooth, rolling baseline that looked, for the first time in 7 hours, like the readout of a sleeping child rather than a crisis. The thermal readout began a steady, gentle descent, not a plunge but a controlled return, the way a ship decelerates from emergency speed to cruising. Tessith checked her scanner, checked it again, and looked up at Orathan with an expression that combined professional astonishment with something closer to shame. Orathan did not return her look. He was staring at the ceramic disc on the child's chest, the 6-credit device built from salvage, with the fixed intensity of a man watching his entire professional framework undergo involuntary revision. At 22 minutes he cleared his throat. The sound was loud in the quiet ward. The cascade markers are declining. The immune targeting has shifted. It appears to be responding to the decoy. He paused. The word decoy sat in his mouth like something foreign. The misidentification pathway is redirecting. Autonomic function is stabilizing across all monitored parameters. Nessa nodded once. She did not say "I told you so." She did not look at Orathan. She was watching the child's face, the way the tension around the small closed eyes was softening, the way the jaw unclenched by degrees, the way the shallow, rapid breathing of distress deepened into something that sounded like the beginning of rest. At 31 minutes, Ilienne opened her eyes. They were pale silver, luminous, enormous in a face that had grown thin over 7 hours of crisis. They fixed on the ceiling, on the ambient light panels casting their soft clinical glow, and then, slowly, tracked sideways until they found the human woman standing beside the bed. "Who are you?" Ilienne whispered. Her voice was barely a sound, the exhalation of a throat too exhausted to produce anything stronger. "I'm Nessa," the medic said. She leaned down slightly so the child would not have to lift her head. "I'm a doctor. You were very sick, but you're going to be all right. Your hands are warm." Nessa looked down. At some point during the waiting, she could not have said exactly when, because it was not a conscious decision but a reflex so deeply embedded in her practice that it preceded thought. the unconscious gesture of someone who has spent years sitting beside sick children in places where machines were scarce and monitoring equipment unreliable, and sometimes the only diagnostic instrument that worked was the human hand on a small arm, feeling for temperature, for tremor, for the subtle shift in muscle tension that meant the crisis was passing. She had placed her hand on the child's forearm. Her hand, rough and brown and mapped with small scars, rested on the child's silver skin like a patch of earth on new snow. Human body temperature runs about 4 degrees higher than yours, she said. We run warm. It's nice. The child's silver eyes were already closing, but her thin fingers curled weakly, slowly, with the deliberate effort of a body that had almost nothing left around 2 of Nessa's fingers and held on. Nessa did not pull away. She stood there, her hand held by a commander's daughter in a palace infirmary that smelled of crystal antiseptic and perfect cold air, and she waited for the child to fall asleep the way she had waited beside cots in a cargo bay with a cracked floor. Patiently, without agenda, with the quiet presence of someone who understood that sometimes the most important thing a medic does is simply not leave. From behind the glass, Commander Thyrokos watched the human field medic hold his daughter's hand, and for the first time in 7 hours, his bioluminescent stress markers dimmed from amber to their resting pale blue. The frustration did not leave, it changed. It had been a hot, blinding thing for 7 hours, rage at the failure of his physicians, his remote specialists, the entire apparatus of Vithrani medical supremacy that had surrounded his daughter's bed and produced nothing but protocols that didn't work and consultations that arrived too late. Now it cooled and compacted and turned inward, toward the harder question, because the question forming in his mind was not what the human medic had done. It was why she had been needed at all. 8 months. She had treated a half Vithrani child for this exact condition 8 months ago, filed a report, documented the mechanism, the treatment, the materials, the outcome. The report had been deposited into an administrative queue designated auxiliary non-critical because it originated from a refugee camp, from a non-Vithrani practitioner, from a woman who cleaned wounds in a converted cargo bay with instruments she built from salvaged scrap. His daughter had seized for 7 hours because the system designed to protect her could not see the person who knew how to save her. 43 minutes after the emitter was placed, the cascade fully broke. Nessa ran a final assessment with her battered stethoscope, gently peeled the ceramic disc from the sleeping child's chest, and tucked it back into her field bag. Iliene was sleeping, real sleep, not the fitful thrashing of the crisis, but the deep, boneless rest of a body that has stopped fighting itself and surrendered to the slow, patient work of repair. Orothan approached Nessa as she repacked her bag. His expression was a complicated archaeology, professional humiliation layered over genuine relief, with something harder and less nameable beneath both. The emitter, you constructed it from refugee supplies. Standard issue thermal coils, a ceramic substrate from a broken diagnostic panel, and adhesive bandage backing. Nessa zipped her bag shut. Total material cost is approximately 6 credits. 6 credits, his voice was surgically flat. The hard part was never the device, physician. The hard part was understanding the mechanism. That took 3 years of field observations across 4 species, pattern recognition, cross-referencing symptoms across populations nobody was tracking, documenting what worked in conditions nobody was measuring. The Vithrani case was the 5th species. Each one taught me something the previous ones hadn't. And you published none of this. Nessa stood, shouldering her bag. She was nearly 2 feet shorter than Orothan, and she met his luminous violet eyes without adjusting for the height, which meant she was looking up at a steep angle and did not appear to notice or care. I filed reports with every case. Refugee medical channel, auxiliary non-critical classification. The reports are in your system, physician Orothan, every one, dated, documented with full treatment protocols and patient outcomes. She paused. Nobody reads the auxiliary channel. The silence had a weight that settled on every shoulder in the room. Koss entered the ward. The pressure seal hissed shut behind him, and every physician straightened. Nessa did not straighten. She turned, saw him, and waited with the same unhurried patience she had shown since she walked through the door, not deference, not defiance, just the steady readiness of a person who had stopped performing for audiences years ago and simply did the work. He crossed the ward to his daughter's bedside. Ilienne slept with her mouth slightly open, her silver hair spread across the pillow like spilled light, her vital signs scrolling steady and calm on the monitors above her head. He touched her forehead with his fingertips. Cool. Normal. The temperature she ran when she was healthy and laughing and chasing light moths through the garden on bare feet. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned to the human medic. How many children have you treated in the refugee center? The question was not what anyone expected. Nessa's eyebrows lifted, a fractional movement, barely visible. Since my assignment began. Approximately 1,400. In what conditions? A converted cargo bay with 20 beds, intermittent power on a tertiary grid, and a medical inventory I supplement with whatever I can build from surplus materials. She said it without bitterness, without self-pity, as a simple cataloging of operational parameters. I have one nursing assistant, a Drelathi woman named Fail. We work alternating 16-hour shifts. 16-hour shifts in a cargo bay for 5 years. The children don't stop getting sick on a schedule, Commander. Koss looked at her, really looked, the way he had not looked at a non-Vithrani in the entire span of his command. He saw the worn fabric of her jacket, the knotted bootlace, the stethoscope coiled in the side pocket of her bag. He saw the tiredness in her eyes, not the acute kind that comes from one bad day, but the deep, compacted exhaustion of years spent doing work that nobody measured, in a place nobody visited, for people nobody counted. He had spent 7 hours furious at the failure of specialists. This woman had spent 5 years working without any. Who is your supervisor? Administratively, the Auxiliary Medical Division, Refugee Services Branch, Frontier Administrative Office. She paused. Functionally, no one. The last staffing review was 19 months ago, conducted remotely. A form was sent. I filled it out. Nobody followed up. Koss felt the frustration shift again, not the blinding heat of the crisis, but something colder and more structural. The frustration of a man realizing the system he had served his entire career had a shape he had never examined, and that shape had edges, and people had been cut on those edges for years while he walked the corridors above them. He turned to Orothan. Physician, does your archive contain the medic's findings on thermal rejection syndrome? It does not. Then enter them. Today, under her name and her name alone, cross-referenced, fully indexed, accessible to every medical practitioner in the Ascendancy. If I learn that the treatment she demonstrated in this room is attributed to this department or filed without her name attached, I will close this department and rebuild it from the foundation. Orothan's ears went flat. He bowed the deep, stiff bow of a man whose objections had been permanently overruled. Understood, Commander. Koss turned back to Nessa. She was watching him with an expression he could not fully parse, not gratitude exactly, not suspicion, something between. The look of a person who has learned through long experience that promises made by authority figures in moments of emotional relief rarely survive the walk back to the office. Medic Drummond, I am offering you a position in the Royal Infirmary, full physician's rank, facilities, staff, equipment, and a research budget to formalize your field work. The ward went silent. Orothan's expression folded inward. Nessa looked at him for a long moment, then she shook her head. No. The word sat in the sterile air like a stone that refused to move. No, Koss repeated. Your daughter is going to be fine, Commander. She'll sleep through the night, wake up hungry, and be running through your garden by tomorrow afternoon. The emitter technique works. Your physicians can replicate it. I'll leave complete documentation, material specifications, and calibration procedures before I go. That is not the point. It's exactly the point. Something firmer had entered her voice, not confrontation, but bedrock. Right now there are 212 children in the KL-7 refugee center. 61 are under 5. 19 are currently symptomatic with conditions your auxiliary system doesn't have protocols for. Because the protocols were written for Vithrani patients in Vithrani facilities by Vithrani physicians, and the refugees are not Vithrani. She shifted her bag on her shoulder. If I take your offer, those children lose their only doctor. The Royal Infirmary gains a field medic who'll spend her career writing reports nobody needs because this place already works. It has resources, staff, oversight. It doesn't work out there. That's where the gap is. That's where I'm needed. Koss stared at her. Behind the glass, his daughter slept peacefully, saved by a woman who had built the cure from 6 credits of salvage in a cargo bay that nobody had inspected in 5 years. The frustration completed its transformation. What had started as fury had passed through cold anger, through structural disappointment, and arrived at something quieter and heavier. The clear-eyed recognition that the system he served had worked exactly as designed to allocate resources to places already visible and starve the places that were not, to credential certain people and render others invisible, to weigh certain reports and let others sink into administrative silence. Then what do you need? He asked. The question surprised her. He saw it, the slight widening of her eyes, the fractional pause, the brief unguarding of a face that had learned to expect nothing from authority. Nobody had asked her that before, not in 5 years, not once. Power, she said. Her voice had changed, still steady, but thinner, closer to the surface of something deeper. Consistent power. The cargo bay runs on a tertiary grid that fails twice a week. When it fails, I lose refrigeration, sterilization, and light. I performed a surgical drainage by chemical lantern 3 months ago because the grid dropped mid-procedure. What else? Beds, real ones. I have 20 cargo-rated cots, half with stress fractures in the frames. I reinforce them with bonding tape. A child fell through a cot 2 weeks ago. 7 stitches with suture thread I repurposed from a packing kit. What else? She was looking at him differently now, not with the measured patience of a field medic, but with the rawer expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just been asked, for the first time, how heavy it is. A second medic, pediatric, cross-species, fail, and I haven't had a rest day in 7 months. 2 weeks ago she fractured her wrist during a seizure response. She set the bone herself, one-handed, because I was in surgery and couldn't leave the table. Koss was quiet. What else? Records integration. The words came faster, as if a door had opened and pressure was escaping. My reports go into the auxiliary non-critical channel. Nobody reads them. I've documented treatments for 7 conditions that don't exist in your archive. Thermal rejection is one of 7. If those reports were in the primary database, every physician on every Vithrani world would have access. Every child who presents with thermal rejection syndrome would be treated in hours instead of. She stopped, her jaw tightened. She looked toward the sleeping child on the med platform, and Koss saw her throat work. Instead of nearly dying, while 9 specialists argue about precedent. The ward was very still. Commander Thyral Koss had spent 30 years giving orders. He understood systems, how they succeeded, how they failed. He had always believed, with the confidence of a man whose systems had always worked for him, that failure was a matter of insufficient effort. Standing in the infirmary, watching a human medic with a knotted bootlace fight to keep her voice steady while listing the things she had needed for 5 years and never received, He understood for the first time that the machine had been responding all along. It was designed to see certain people and render others invisible. It was designed to weigh certain reports and let others sink. His daughter was alive because one woman had refused to be invisible. She had not demanded recognition. She had not petitioned the hierarchy. She had sat in a cargo bay and built cures from scrap and filed reports no one read and kept working, because the children did not stop getting sick on a schedule. Orathan, Koss said without looking away from Nessa. Effective immediately. The refugee medical facility at KL7 is reclassified from auxiliary non-critical to primary essential. Commander, that classification requires. I am authorizing it. Command prerogative. Primary essential classification. Full central power grid connection. Equipment requisition parity with this infirmary. Staffing allocation for 3 additional medical practitioners, at least one with cross-species pediatric training. Infrastructure upgrade, proper flooring, drainage, climate control, surgical-grade lighting. And every report filed from that facility, past, present, and future, enters the Imperial Medical Archive under the practitioner's name. He paused, the pause had weight. All of them going back 5 years, under her name, every one. Nessa's expression shifted. The bedrock patience, the compacted tiredness, cracked along a seam she hadn't known was there. Through the crack Koss glimpsed something he recognized, the look of officers who had served forgotten deployments for years without reinforcement, without recognition, and who one day received a communication that began with the words, "We see you." She did not cry, but her eyes were bright, and her hand, the one not holding her bag strap, closed into a fist at her side, held there, and then slowly opened. The opening was like an exhale she had been holding for 5 years. "The cargo bay needs a proper floor," she said, her voice rougher now. "The drainage backs up in the rains. The children get respiratory infections from the mold." Koss almost smiled, the small shift in expression of a commander who realizes he is not issuing orders to a subordinate, but negotiating with an immovable force. "Write it all down. Priority order. I'll have a quartermaster at your location by morning." And Fail's wrist. She needs imaging and possible resetting. She won't mention it because she doesn't want to lose shift coverage. "She'll receive treatment here, today." Nessa nodded once. Then she looked at the child one final time, Ilienne sleeping with her silver hair spread like light, her vitals calm and scrolling. "She'll want something simple when she wakes, not a medical tray, something warm and familiar, whatever she ate before she got sick. Children heal faster when the first thing they taste reminds them of being well." Koss looked at his daughter. He thought about yesterday morning, 1,000 years ago, when she had been chasing light moths through the garden. "Honeyed grain porridge," he said quietly. "She calls it sunshine food because it is golden." Nessa's mouth curved barely at the corners, a tired smile that reached her eyes for a moment. "Sunshine food, that'll do it." She shouldered her bag, turned and walked toward the door. Her boots left dusty prints on the white floor, prints the automated cleaning systems were already dissolving, erasing her passage the way the system had been erasing her work for 5 years. "Medic Drummond." She stopped at the door, turned. Commander Tyrell Koss stood beside his daughter's bed, one hand on the railing, his stress markers settled to calm blue, his expression carrying something Vithrani faces rarely showed to outsiders. The quiet vulnerability that comes when armor has served its purpose, and the person underneath is briefly visible. "Thank you," he said. Informal Vithrani, the phrase was an elaborate construction, honorifics, station rank, ritualized debt acknowledgement that took a full minute to recite. Koss did not use it. He used the informal version. The one Vithrani used with family. The one that did not mean "I owe you," but meant "I see you." Nessa looked at him. Then she inclined her head, a small, unhurried nod. the gesture of someone who has been seen and does not need ceremony around it. "Take care of her, Commander." She walked out. The pressure seal whispered shut. Her boot prints dissolved from the floor within seconds, cleaned away by systems designed to erase every trace of anyone who did not belong. Commander Thyrolkos stood at his daughter's bedside for a long time after the medic left, and the thing he felt, the thing that had replaced the frustration, layer by geological layer, over the course of 7 hours, was gratitude. Not the ceremonial kind, the real kind. The kind that arrives only when you have stood at the edge of losing everything and watched a stranger with a knotted bootlace and a 6-credit ceramic disc pull your child back from the dark, because she refused to be invisible, and because you, and everyone like you, had been the reason she was invisible in the first place. He looked at Eliane. She breathed, slow, steady, alive. He reached for his console and began composing a message to the Frontier Administrative Office. 5 pages. Every failure of oversight, every buried report, every resource allocation that had chosen visibility over need. It named no individual and indicted an architecture. It ended with one directive. The auxiliary non-critical classification was to be reviewed across every Frontier facility in the Ascendancy, and every report filed by non-Vithrani practitioners elevated to primary review. He signed it with his command seal and sent it before he could reconsider, before the habits of institutional caution could reassert themselves, and suggest that perhaps he should route the message through proper channels. Perhaps he should consult with the administrative division. Perhaps he should wait until the morning when his judgment would be less colored by the residual shock of nearly losing his child. He did not wait. He had learned something about waiting today, that the system's preference for process over urgency was not caution. It was cowardice dressed in procedure, and his daughter had been the cost of that cowardice. He sat with the sent confirmation glowing on his console for a long moment, feeling the weight of what he had set in motion. The message would reach the Frontier Administrative Office within minutes. It would cascade through the bureaucratic layers of the Ascendancy and the irony was not lost on him. Like an autoimmune response of its own, the system's institutional defenses activating against a directive that challenged its foundational assumptions about whose work mattered and whose did not. There would be resistance. There would be objections filed through proper channels. Career administrators would draft carefully worded responses explaining why the reclassification required further study, further review, further delay. He would answer each one, personally, with his command seal for as long as it took. Then he pulled a chair to his daughter's bedside, a straight-back seat from the far wall, not the Vithrani perch, and sat down. He took Eliane's small silver hand in both of his and held it the way the human medic had held it. Gently, without agenda, the way you hold something precious that you almost lost and have only begun to understand the weight of. In the morning, Eliane would wake. She would be hungry. He would bring her sunshine food in a bowl he carried himself, walking the palace corridors in his command uniform with a dish of golden porridge in his hands. He would sit with her while she ate, and he would not attend the morning briefing because the briefing could wait. For the first time in his career, the fleet could wait. 14 kilometers south, Nessa Drummond walked back into a cargo bay with a cracked concrete floor and 20 failing cots and 212 children who needed her. The bay smelled the way it always smelled, of antiseptic solution she mixed herself from industrial cleaning concentrate diluted to medical grade, of the damp that seeped through the cracked foundation during the wet season, of the particular warm scent of children sleeping in close quarters under blankets that were not quite warm enough. The overhead lighting, 3 of the original 12 panels still functioning, the rest dark since a power surge 8 months ago that nobody from facilities had come to repair, cast uneven pools of white light across the rows of cots, leaving the corners in shadow. She set down her field bag on the table she used as a desk, a cargo manifest station repurposed with a cloth cover to hold her instruments, and checked on the 3 patients she had left in Fail's care. The Drelathi boy in cot 7 was sleeping. His respiratory rate improved since the morning. The Kalosi girl in cot 12 had kept down her evening meal, which was progress after 3 days of nausea. The Vithrani toddler in cot 3, a refugee child from the border provinces, brought in yesterday with a rash that Nessa suspected was an allergic reaction to the synthetic bedding material, but could not confirm without a dermatological scanner she did not have, was awake and watching her with large, pale eyes. She checked his rash, applied a topical paste she had compounded from available supplies, and settled him back down with a few quiet words. Then she examined Fail's wrist, gently, over protest that it was fine. "It's not fine," Nessa said. "You're going to the Royal Infirmary in the morning. Commander's orders." Fail stared at her. "The Royal Infirmary doesn't treat." "It does now." Nessa sat on an overturned supply crate, pulled her datapad from her bag, and wrote up case 1407. Thermal rejection syndrome, full Vithrani, age 4, female. Outcome, full recovery. Treatment, thermal signature emitter, ceramic substrate, 6 credits of materials. In the supply case beside her, the ceramic discs sat in a row, 5 of them, each built from scraps, each a flat coin that had pulled a child back from a place medicine alone could not reach. 5 before today, 6 now. She closed the notes, picked up her stethoscope, cracked housing, diaphragm replaced twice with metal from ration tin lids, and walked to the first bed, where a Kalosi boy with a persistent cough was waiting for his evening check. She placed the stethoscope on his chest. She listened. Tomorrow a quartermaster would arrive. Real beds, consistent power, a floor that didn't breed mold, staff. Her reports, 5 years of them, entered into the archive that served worlds. She didn't know that yet. She only knew the next patient and the one after that. She worked the way she had always worked, one child at a time, one breath at a time, with warm hands and a bag full of things she had built because nobody else was going to build them. And 14 kilometers north, in a royal infirmary that hummed with flawless climate control and light that never flickered, a commander held his sleeping daughter's hand and understood, finally, what the human medic had taught him since the moment she walked through the door with dust on her boots and a 6-credit cure in her bag. That the most important people in an empire are the ones the empire has not yet learned to see, and that seeing them, truly seeing them, without reservation, is not a kindness you bestow. It is a debt you discover you have owed for a very long time. And the only honest response is to begin paying it late, inadequately, and with the heavy, clarifying gratitude of a man who understands at last that he should have been paying it all along.